Excuse me while I put on my poshest accent for this. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Ian Elliott. I'm a research scholar with the Justice Centre for Research here at Penn State. And I have the great pleasure of introducing the next and final speaker, Dr. Keith Kaufman. Dr. Kaufman is a tenured professor at the Portland State University and a licensed clinical psychologist. Since receiving his Ph.D. from the University of South Florida in 1985, Dr. Kaufman has been instrumental in the development of preventative interventions in a number of areas of sexual victimization. Over his career, Dr. Kaufman has secured over $2 million in funding for many diverse projects relating to the prevention of sexual abuse and sex offender behavior and treatment, from major funding bodies such as the National Institute of Mental Health and the Centre for Disease Control. He's currently leading the development of psychoeducational treatment and community transition models for juvenile sex offenders across the state of Oregon. He is also developing and evaluating a variety of healthy sexuality and rape prevention education programs in that state. He's also currently working with the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape on a project evaluating the effectiveness of situational prevention in boys and girls clubs across 4 states. He's on the editorial boards of various academic journals related to child abuse, including Child Maltreatment and Sexual Abuse, a Journal of Research and Treatment. He has also served as president for the Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers, the largest network of professionals involved in intervention with sex offenders in North America. Recently, in 2010, Dr. Kaufman published his comprehensive and well-received edited book, The Prevention of Sexual Violence, a Practitioner's Sourcebook. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Keith Kaufman.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you. I appreciate you staying here. I know that the swimming pool is a real draw today. I'm very excited about being here, and I feel honored to be part of this distinguished panel. I'm very excited about talking a little bit today about what child sexual abusers can teach us about enhancing the quality of prevention. The American Medical Association described child sexual abuse as a silent, violent epidemic. And if we look historically at the response to child sexual abuse, what we find is that most of the investment we've made in service and financially has been to after-the-fact treatment of victims, offenders, as well as the criminal justice system. And this is punctuated by a quote from Prevent Child Abuse America that says, for every dollar we spend in treating the effects of child sexual abuse, we spend only a penny in preventing it. This is particularly critical when we hear things like what George Albee had to say about this, and which was that no mass disorder afflicting mankind is ever brought under control or eliminated by attempts at treating the individual. And part of what Dr. Albee was saying to us was that we really need a balanced approach and a balanced investment in prevention as well as treatment. In the brief time that I have with you today, I'm going to talk about three types of prevention. There's a whole host of different definitions for prevention. Let me just tell you a little bit about what I'm going to focus on and briefly what those definitions are. I'm going to talk about tertiary prevention, and tertiary prevention is typically after-the-fact treatment of offenders and victims or survivors. It's an attempt with offenders to prevent recidivism. With victims, it's an attempt to deal with some of the potential after effects of their experience. At the other end of the continuum, we're going to talk about primary prevention. Primary prevention focuses on the general public. The intent is to prevent the development of risks and to create protective factors across the lifespan. And right in the middle is secondary prevention. Secondary prevention focuses on the identification of particular risks and trying to ensure that those risks don't develop into the kinds of problems we're concerned about in terms of offending or victimization. And as Dr. Albee was suggesting to us, part of our goal is to create much more of a balanced approach and to encourage decision makers to provide funding in a way that balances things out, and we'll talk more about that. Goya said, fantasy abandoned by reason produces impossible monsters. And I think if you look over time, you'd probably agree with me that we're kind of children of the media. And I think over time we habituate and our ideas become shaped by the media. And unfortunately, the media has presented us with horrific cases, with negative, with things that are bad, and have really created for us impossible monsters. I think that's been compounded by the fact that we went through a long period of time, still see today, people pushing the idea of tough on crime and policies that at times lead to laws and decisions and at times programs that are ineffectual and illogical. I think that the combination really puts us in a position of feeling like there's not much to do and there's not much reason to even think about offenders other than locking them away. One of our colleagues, Mark Chaffin, commented on this with regard to juvenile offenders in a wonderfully creative, and Mark is always creative, journal article on child maltreatment called "Our Minds Are Made Up, Don't Confuse Us with the Facts," a commentary on policies concerning children with sexual behavior problems and juvenile sex offenders. And in that commentary, he says, seeking to protect children from sex crimes is an entirely good and appropriate policy. But heartbreak, fear, and anger do not necessarily generate good child protection policy. Good policy requires accurate facts. And to let you know how creative Mark is, he goes so far as to quote Stephen Colbert. And the quote is, "It used to be that everyone was entitled to their own opinion, but not their own facts. But that's not the case anymore. Facts matter not at all. Perception is everything." And I mention this because really a lot of what my talk is about trying to draw people back to the facts and try to ensure that we're making good decisions based on the facts. You have my heartfelt sympathies for the tragedy that you've all endured. As David said this morning, it's something that's affected everyone in terms of collateral damage, most of all the direct victims, but many other people. But what I want to say to you is, I think there's a silver lining and there's reason for optimistic ideas, and the optimism around that has to do with the fact that we have the world's attention, or at least the country's attention. And I think that this is a great opportunity to re-examine our assumptions, our policies, our response to child sexual abuse, to try to make prevention a priority, and really to establish the eradication of sexual violence as a national agenda. What I hope to do in the short time that I have with you is address three areas. First, to examine what we can learn from the facts about child sexual offenders to promote a safer community. Second, to look a little bit more closely at offenders' behaviors and to think about how more closely focusing on the behaviors can enhance the quality of prevention. And third, to think more about prevention in general and how we can maximize prevention to be more effective in creating safer communities. So let me start with what can we learn from the facts about offenders to promote prevention and make the community safer. I have to thank David. I felt like it was a wonderful trailer for some of the things I'm going to talk to you about, and I do think it's important to repeat a lot of these messages because we've had a lot of trouble over the last 20, 25 years of getting these messages. I'm going to do that in the context of 5 myths. The first is there's a typical and recognizable offender profile. Second, all sex offenders are pedophiles. Third, that sex offenders are untreatable. Fourth, that most sex offenders get locked up for life. And fifth, that current sex offender laws increase public safety. So the first myth, that there's a typical sex offender profile that's recognizable. As many of you know, the facts suggest that there is no reliable single profile of offenders. And although we have a lot of trouble thinking about it this way, most of the offenders are much more like us than they're different, at least on apparent sake, and maybe in many other ways. It's also critical that we know and remember that sex offending has not been associated with a particular sexual preference, age, race, religious affiliation, or economic group. I want to broaden this just a little bit and give you some other facts about offenders, because that may be an area where you're not as familiar. Another critical thing to know about offenders and to remember is that almost all offenders are known to their victims. And while there may be some variations by age of the victim, we can say conservatively and comfortably that less than 10% of offenders are strangers. I also think it's critically important that we remember that we need to address juvenile offenders as part of this process. They account for more than a third of the sexual offenses that are reported. We know that 13% of youth are under 12 years of age, and that estimates suggest that about 7% are female. Their motivations vary considerably. And most importantly, estimates suggest that 85 to 95% of youthful offenders will never commit another sexual crime. Never commit another sexual crime. Here's some comparisons between some large epidemiological data comparing juvenile to adult child sexual offenders. As we know, with regard to victim relationship, again, here we see stranger abuse, less than 5%, the predominance being acquaintance, and family being a little bit more prevalent for adults. Victim gender, again, the largest proportion of victims are female. The adolescents seem to have a little bit more in the way of male victims, and some of that may have to do with their familial offending and access to male siblings. Here, I want to bring your attention to the fact that much of juvenile offending can be very serious and very intrusive. It is interesting to note that across both adult and juvenile offenders that 49 or 42%, the largest proportion, had to do with fondling. That's not to say that there weren't other more invasive types of abuse that involved, but that's the index crime. Most of the abuse that we're talking about here occurred in a residence or in someone's home. A bit more so for adults. Schools and colleges seem to be a little bit more of a prevalent location for juveniles as opposed to adults. There's a variety of other settings. So myth number 2, all sex offenders are pedophiles. And you heard a little bit about this from David this morning, so I'll go quickly. But the World Health Organization defines pedophilia as a sexual preference for children, boys or girls or both, usually a pre-pubertal or early pubertal age. The DSM, or Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, has 3 major criteria. The first is recurrent intense sexual arousal around fantasies, urges, or behaviors that involves sexual activity with a prepubescent child or children. The second is actually acting on those urges or being so affected by those urges that it disrupts your life. And third, the criteria that a person is at least 16 years of age and that the person that they're fixated on is 5 years or more older. Here's some data from some large studies, I should say large studies across a number of different time periods that suggest to us that for adult offenders, that the majority of offenders tend not to be a pedophile. Data here suggests somewhere between 40 and 50% would meet the criteria for that diagnosis. With juveniles, somewhat less, about 40%. And again, I think we need to be particularly careful with juveniles because this may include juveniles that are below 16 and technically wouldn't meet some of the criteria. So if we're thinking about the majority of offenders not being pedophiles, then how do we define them? There are a lot of different attempts, but some of the categories I want to mention that I think may be more clinically related but also appear in the research are the status offenders that David talked about this morning, opportunistic offenders who may have no arousal, in particular to a youth or someone who's prepubescent, but by virtue of circumstance or maybe use of alcohol and drugs may offend, or just terribly poor judgment, familial offenders, and general criminal offenders. And what I mean by that is I mean folks who act out and commit crimes in a variety of ways, and one of them just happens to be a sexual crime. The third myth I want to mention is that sex offenders are untreatable. It's really interesting if you look at meta-analysis, and again, a meta-analysis is somebody who's collected all of or most of the studies in an area that are of high quality. Hansen has done 2. The first one looked at 82 studies. The second one looked across 43 studies. And as you'll notice, he reports 10 to a little bit less than 14% sexual recidivism across probably most of the more recent high-quality studies in the literature. You'll notice that that final column talks about recidivism in other ways. That could be violent offending, but could also be such things as probation violations. The final study on this chart is with regard to juveniles, and that reports 5% sexual recidivism. And I will mention that in my state, in Oregon, that for the youth that are released from Oregon correctionals facilities, that over the last 5 to 7 years, that the recidivism rate has been 3.5%. Just to give you some broader perspective, that even when epidemiological studies have looked on a grosser level, here's Bureau of Justice statistics from 2002, looked at 300,000 prisoners. Amazingly enough, 3 years after being released, more than 67% of them had reoffended in some way. You'll notice that robbers and burglars and other folks are in the 70+% of recidivism. And who is the lowest group? Sexual offenders. And remember that that 41% is probably made up in large part of non-sexual offenses and in smaller part of sexual offenses. Myth number 4, that most sex offenders get locked up for life. Just very briefly, I remember doing research around the country, and it was at a time where there were lots of laws that were coming up that increased sentences, those tough on crime things, and I would stop people at times when there were signs up in a community and ask them, you know, what their sense is about this new law, and I would say, how is that going to affect these youth, because these were signs about youth, when they come back home? And they would almost always look at me and say, well, what do you mean when they get out? And somehow people had the perception that once locked up, always locked up. Part of what we find is that virtually all sex offenders return to the community. In 2002, the national average was 64 months, which, by the way, was the second most severe average sentence to murderers. Okay? More recently, in Washington State, data suggests that 97% of offenders are released back into the community. If we look at the information on registered sex offenders from 2011, there were a little more than 739,000. Of those, about 65% actually live in the community. The difference is made up by incarcerated offenders, offenders who have been deported, and believe it or not, deceased offenders. About a third of the registered sex offenders who come back to the community receive supervision. So that means that 2/3 don't, and yet we still have very good sexual recidivism rates, or very low, I should say. It's also interesting to note that about 5% of registered sex offenders are just absolutely missing, don't know where they are. And that's a much more conservative number than some of the numbers that have been circulated. Myth number 5, that current sex offender laws increase public safety. Usually when we talk about laws, we talk about 3 types of laws. Talk about residency restrictions. Typically, they would preclude an offender from living, for example, within 2,000 feet of a park or school. Notification, which mandates community notification when an offender is released into the community. And registration, which requires offenders to register with local police, and then in most cases puts that information on a database on the internet for people to search. So first, with regard to residency laws, there's quite a bit of information that suggests that by the time you finish doing the math about where people can live, that there's very few places, especially in most urban areas, that a sex offender can live, and that actually it's really increased the number of homeless sex offenders, which is a real problem because it's a whole lot harder to manage and monitor a sex offender if they're homeless. It also creates a lot in the way of stresses that we know may push an offender back towards reoffending. So really not getting the sense that residency restrictions are something that are increasing community safety. And actually with juvenile offenders, Elizabeth Letourneau has done some really nice studies that actually suggest that with juveniles that some of the laws actually increase recidivism rates. And some of the states, believing that offenders are using this as a ploy, have actually increased the restrictions when somebody says that they're homeless. Levinson and Cotter studied 135 Florida sex offenders, and that's the state that brought you, we'll drop our sex offenders off under the Julia Tuttle Causeway, which seems like a good idea to someone in terms of homeless sex offenders. They found that 22% were forced to move out of a home, that 25% were unable to return to a home after serving time, and that there were a whole host of very negative impacts that, again, concern us because we worry about things that push offenders back towards reoffending, that destabilize them, and that make the community less safe. I will mention that there's a very creative program called Circles of Support that began in Canada that was faith-based, that was attached to some churches. It's a program that takes offenders who come out of prison, that links them up with a support group, and that support group also takes responsibility for their monitoring and accountability. And the studies that we have suggest that that's led to reductions in recidivism. And it's also being replicated here in the United States. We've just had a set of funding for new programs. It's also been replicated in the UK as well. Registration and notification. I want to say that most of the studies out there indicate that there's little or no impact of registration and notification in terms of reducing recidivism, and there are actually studies that have suggested that it's linked to increases in recidivistic behavior. And maybe part of it has to do with this final quote, which is that there's a tendency for registration and notification in particular, to lead communities to engage in what you might call overreactive behavior, which at times has actually been trying to directly get offenders to leave their homes and move out of the neighborhoods. I will say on the other side that, as you might imagine, these have been very popular kinds of laws. Unfortunately, I think that they're more popular than they should be because it's usually the public not knowing that these laws may not be as effective as we hope them to be. I do think that there are instances where the registration in particular is very helpful. So for example, if a crime has been committed in your law enforcement, that it does help you find who are the folks that you'd be concerned about. Also, there may be a particular place for registration and notification with regard to high-risk offenders, and it may be the kind of extra sets of eyes that may actually help in terms of monitoring people who are more dangerous when they come back to the community. So I want to be sure that there isn't any misunderstanding from you with regard to what I'm saying. Clearly, there are difficult and perhaps impossible to treat offenders out there, and that some offenders will reoffend. However, I really think that this is one of those areas where this opportunity to relook at what we're doing really offers the potential to enhance the quality of safety in the community in an area that I think we've really neglected. So let me give you some ideas of some of the things that you can do. Right after the storm passes, you can start, okay? So the first is I think we need to broaden how we think about what we're doing. And I think that if you take a look, most of our effort has been around a focus on risky, inappropriate, and illegal behaviors. And in reality, we know from making change that really a more balanced approach where we don't ignore the risky behaviors, we deal with it, but we also try to look at promoting healthy, more stable, and legal types of responses is going to be a better way to go. Second thing is I think we need to move the focus to the facts. I think that has to do with educating and holding the feet of decision makers and legislators to the fire so the programs they're funding and the decisions they're making are consistent with the data that we do have, and also encouraging the media I'm not naive enough to believe that the media is going to stop tracking horrific cases, but I think we need to get them to also put information on the TV and newspapers, on the internet, about what we can do in terms of prevention and what we can do to enhance community safety. I think we also need to ensure that all victims receive high-quality services. This talk isn't about victims and survivors, but I think it's really important that we don't lose that thread as part of this larger plan. I think we need to advocate for programs that address who offenders really are and realistic risks. And again, I think we need to ensure that decision makers are part of this discussion. I think we have to spread the word that the majority of offenders can be treated and that that's related to community safety. As a matter of fact, I didn't talk about it, but there are studies that demonstrate that high-quality treatment within the offender group is better than no treatment at all in terms of recidivism. So I think we need to think about how we can mandate treatment for as many, if not all, offenders, especially those who are incarcerated. And I think that treatment needs to be specific to the sex offender issues, but it needs to be broader so that we position them to be successful in the community. And that's point number 7. I think we need to work towards making the community safer by fostering offenders' success when they're reintegrated. As I said to you, almost all offenders will return to the community. We need to make a commitment to figuring out creative solutions to housing, more jobs, more job skills, and focus more on programs like circles of support, promising programs like that. And finally, I think we need to demand that the precious dollars we're spending are spent on programs where we can demonstrate the effectiveness. If there are large programs that are wolves in sheep's clothing, if you will, in terms of masquerading as effective community safety programs, but they're not, we need to recapture that money and we need to put it into prevention programs that have efficacy or that are promising. When you get a copy of this, these are some websites that I'd encourage you to take a look at. Wonderful resources, a lot of information in this regard. So the second area I want to talk to you about is I want to talk to you about more specific offender behaviors and how attending to those behaviors, I think, can enhance the quality of the prevention that we're providing. And I want to say to you that usually when we talk about these behaviors, we either call them grooming behavior or modus operandi. And that really refers to offenders' attempts to manipulate both potential child victims as well as family members, and sometimes staff at places like youth-serving organizations or community organizations. And obviously, we all know what their intent is. It's to lure, gain access, gain trust, and eventually offend and maintain victim silence. And they use a whole host of strategies when they do. And again, like David said, I think it's important to differentiate between offenders who are purposefully having a plan as opposed to those where maybe the more opportunistic offenders. I'd like to give you a little bit of a sense of the richness of the information that we can get from offenders about how we can enhance the quality of prevention. Knowing what they do and how they do it and the strategies they use, I think, is critical to the next step for prevention. I want to show you about 5 minutes of an interview with Jason, not his real name. 18-year-old white male when he was interviewed, arrested twice on sexually related charges, 14 years old when first arrested. This is after 32 months of treatment. He reported his own victimization and had 2 male and 3 female victims. So please take a look. We won't have a lot of time to talk about this, but I want to give you a flavor of how rich this kind of information can be to prevention. Abe?
How much was like attention, time, affection, love? How much was that a part of trying to gain their trust?
100%.
Okay, can you tell me a little bit about that?
As far as affection and love, it wasn't. I never loved my victims. I wanted them to believe that. I manipulated them to believe in it.
Okay.
And as far as being affectionate to them, I never had any affection towards them either. I wanted them to believe that I had affection towards them.
Okay.
And trust major. I wanted them to believe that they could trust me, so that they would have the confidence in me that I wouldn't hurt them.
Okay.
So it's a lot of manipulation.
What kinds of things did you say to gain their trust?
As far as, they would come to me and I'd be like, I'm your friend, I'm one of your only friends, look at all I've done for you. Remember this time and that time, bring back flashbacks of old times we had together. That, let's see, some of the other things to build up their trust.
Let me ask you something different. What kinds of things did you let them do to gain their trust?
Oh, to gain my trust?
Well, as part of trying to get their trust.
Like special privileges?
Yeah, that kind of thing.
As far as, first off with the family members and the neighbors, my family member victims, a lot of times if they come stay the night with me, or like my sister, she lived with me, I'd go as far as letting them use something of mine, letting them listen to my radio, my tapes, play my Nintendo, or if I was watching babysitting, let them stay up an extra, a little bit longer. Let them watch a movie that usually the parents wouldn't let them watch. It's quoted as like a scary movie of Freddy Krueger, or a funny comedy movie that their parents didn't want to watch, or something, or a cartoon. Cartoons were good. As far as neighborhood kids, it was like I babysit them and they would want to eat something that their parents would let them eat, like snack food or something. So I'd let them do that. Borrow something of mine. Let them be the person to pick the basketball team or the football team, or let them be the captain. Little things like that would mean a lot, but it didn't mean nothing to me, really.
Okay. And what kinds of things did you give them to try to get their trust?
Basically, it was three things. It was money, toys, and candy.
Okay.
Because I figured, I already knew that at a young age, you don't have top priorities like, like a regular adult would have, money, all this and that, and this car and all that. I went with the basics, candy. Every kid loves candy, and they feel like when they get that, they've done something good. They've done the right thing. And as far as money, I figured if I gave this little, this young victim money, then he would feel like he was powerful, because I know as a young kid, somebody gave me some money, I felt like I was on top of the world, and I could go to the store and buy, a lot of things. So that, and as far as toys, about toys.
So if we had more time, I'd show you more of that tape and probably have a very interesting conversation. Jason goes on to talk about his efforts to become part of a family, and he was able to be successful enough to be invited to family reunions. He talked about the fact that when there was an argument, the parents would look to him because they would believe him. He would babysit. He also talked about the fact that despite a lot of effort to do positive things, that when he felt the need to, that he would make threats. And at times when they were playing football, he would clearly let someone know that they could be hurt by him. So again, not all offenders use violence. Not all offenders are strategic about their modus operandi or grooming. But there is a lot we can learn from those offenders who do. Rather than having a conversation, I want to show you a little bit, just some illustration of some of the things from some of our research, and there's other folks who have done research as well. One particular finding is that offenders are sophisticated in the strategies that they use with victims. Some examples are that they use strategies that we would probably call desensitization. So for example, they would desensitize a particular potential victim to touch, where they would start with very appropriate touches, and over time that would become more invasive and more sexual in a way that wouldn't be something that set off red flags. As you know, offenders use pro-social strategies. Sometimes it really isn't a good person or the good part of that person doing things, but other times it's very calculated and very purposeful and strategic. Some offenders are amazingly developmentally sensitive. Jason talks about what he did in terms of giving candy and those things. It's very different than some of the things that he talked about doing with an adolescent victim. And that offenders will use a broad array of strategies to match that to what's going on with the victim. We did find that juvenile offenders were more likely to use pornography, and some of them talked about the use of pornography in terms of both normalizing sexual behaviors to a potential victim, as well as encouraging them to think about, would you like to try this or would you like to try that? And substances were something that older and extrafamilial offenders tended to use. Seemed to have both a sedative effect in terms of gang cooperation, but also in terms of something that they could then use in the future as leverage with a potential victim to say, how would your parents feel about knowing that you got high with me, or something of that sort. Another example is offenders manipulate and groom parents or caregivers. We found that offenders talked about manipulating parents and caregivers both to gain access and also to gain opportunities to actually facilitate the abuse. Some of the behaviors that they talked about was directly befriending and spending time with a parent or caregiver, volunteering to babysit, doing household chores, and actually driving victims around to places, anything that would make it easier on a parent. Offenders' age influences the particular perpetrator patterns. What we found was that juveniles were much more active in using strategies. They used more diverse strategies and they used them more often to keep their victims engaged. There was a whole host of strategies they used. Oftentimes they were tied to how old the victim was, so they were developmentally sensitive. Our belief was that some of the studies that adults didn't use as many strategies because they didn't have to. Many of them were parents, step-parents, they had some authority, some status. They really didn't need to be quite as active. So part of the reason for bringing this up today is my belief is that this type of information can be better integrated into the prevention we do, that it can help us tailor who are the likely offender groups. It can also help us tailor what are the likely risks based on who we're providing the information to or the age of someone's children, for example. It also orients parents and youth to look for red flag behaviors rather than the belief that they'll recognize an offender. Very much what David had said this morning about trying to get people off the idea that they can figure out who an offender is and focusing on behaviors. So the final part of what I want to talk to you about is re-examining prevention. I want to do that in three ways. First, I want to refresh your memory with a general example of prevention, and within that, embed some strategies. Second, what I want to do is apply those strategies to prevention of child sexual abuse. And then within that, for the third thing, is I want to tell you about a wonderful collaboration that I'm very excited about with Boys and Girls Club that is funded by PCAR very generously. So I want to start by saying that we're all preventionists at heart, and that sometimes we forget how often we actually engage in prevention and how well we know it. So for example, if you're running errands with kids in the car, one of the first things we do is put on our seatbelt and theirs. And why do we do that? Well, we want to prevent injury, right? If the flu is going around at work, suddenly everyone's washing their hands, and vitamin C turns up. And hopefully we get a little bit more rest because we're thoughtful about that we can't miss work. Right? And if hypothetically you were giving a talk at Penn State, in a preventive way, you may choose not to pack your Ohio State jersey. And if you're really smart, you might go to the bookstore and buy this jersey instead. And why would you do that? Well, the worst thing to have is a grumpy audience, and you don't want to risk physical injury. So hopefully I've convinced you that we engage in prevention every day and we really know it very well. I also want to say to you that there's only upsides with prevention. It's easy to be enamored with the idea of prevention. We should do it more often and we should advocate for more funding. So let me give you a general example. Normally I would tell you to close your eyes, but it's whatever time in the afternoon, and I know how dangerous that is even with the bright lights. But imagine yourself walking down a very pleasant stream or river that's downstream from a city. And suddenly there's somebody in the water. What do? Well, of course, you help them, right? Now, imagine still that it's not one person in the water, but pretty quickly, there's a whole host of similar-looking people at risk of drowning. What do? Well, first thing is you probably find a better river to take a leisurely walk, right? But hopefully you help them out. I would hope that the other thing you do is you look upstream and you start to ask yourself some questions about what are the kinds of risks that have led to all these people being in the water. And if you did that, what you would find is that there's just this horrific bridge that people insist on continuing to use to take a shortcut. And oftentimes they end up in the water. That it's also a party town. People like their boats, people like their drink, and sometimes it's not a good combination, and they end up in the water. And some of the businesses are not as conscientious as they could be with safety equipment, and some of the employees end up in the water. And finally, it's just a terrific spot for kids in the summer to take a dip. Unfortunately, they don't receive the supervision that they should. Now, I want to back up. This doesn't mean that we're not going to fish people out of the river. Clearly, we need to continue to do the after-the-fact cleanup. We need to take care of people. But it also means that we need to be more thoughtful about looking upstream and investing in things like prevention. Let me talk to you about those advantages of prevention and looking upstream. One advantage is that we know if we intervene in multiple ways with prevention, we're so much more effective. So in our case, we're going to teach more people to swim and make sure that they have flotation devices. At the relationship level, we're going to make sure that the swimming hole for kids ends up being a place that parents are involved and that they're providing supervision. At the institutional level, we're going to make sure that all of those businesses are using proper safety equipment. And in the community, we're going to encourage the Sheriff Patrol to be more active in looking at those fun party boats and making sure that those people aren't going to end up floating in the water. And from a societal standpoint, we're going to look at the rules and regulations around the bridges we have and increase those standards perhaps. Looking upstream also means that we can provide roles for multiple people to address the problem. So we go from a single person throwing life rings to having a role for a whole host of people to get involved in the solution. It also means that we can pick out strategic areas that have been neglected and we can address them. So for example, if you look at the research or the information about bridges, you find that 12% of bridges were structurally deficient. I'm not sure they were thinking about our bridge, but it means that we can start to intervene with a particular kind of problem. It also allows us to engage in better advocacy to balance the funding and the services between after-the-fact intervention and prevention. So let's take those principles and apply them to the prevention of child sexual abuse for a minute and take a look at what that would look like. So if we intervened at multiple levels with child sexual abuse, we would ensure that every youth receives high-quality school-based interventions that are developmentally appropriate. We would find some creative ways to reach all parents. I think one of the biggest problems we have with education around these issues is it's the same 30 parents that keep coming to the assembly and they probably don't need it in the first place. We would, at an institutional level, we would go ahead and we'd make sure that, that school policies foster things like healthy relationships and make sure that they create an environment that's supportive of positive interactions and also have appropriate consequences. At the community level, we would arm all of those bystanders with good information and encourage them to pick out things when they're just at the small seedling level. Pick out things when they're just starting to develop before they become problematic. And at the societal level, we'd be better about influencing the media to give more positive and appropriate messages through TV, movies, and video games, and the internet. We'd seek more funding and more of a balance between after the fact and prevention by advocating for things like increased funding for research, program funding, making sure that we're investing in both victim and offender prevention, And again, we'd recapture funds from ineffective programs and make sure that they go to prevention programs that have some efficacy. We'd also go ahead and we'd intervene on neglected areas. As David mentioned this morning, that one of the areas that I think there's more we can do is the area of organizations, in particular youth-serving organizations. Let me give you a little bit of background about why I think that's so critical. Every single day, approximately 57 million children go off to school. There's an organization that we could do more with. 41 million youth participate in youth sports. 4.6 million are involved in Boys and Girls Club, 2.9 million in Boy Scouts, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. I do want to say that most organizations, especially some of the ones that I've mentioned here, have made strong efforts in this area, but at the same time, we still see evidence of abuse in the media. One of the problems, as we talked about this morning, or as David did, is here is an example of accountable that's not counted. We have no idea. We have no firm data about abuse that occurs in organizations. It makes it very hard for us to advocate for more funding, for more interventions. Also, we know that organizations with limited resources are probably at greater risk and probably have less potential to intervene. So that brings us to this project that I'm so excited about. It's with Boys and Girls Club of America. As a matter of fact, my contact, Les Nichols, is here. You want to give a wave, Les? His position addresses issues about club safety, and that we've received funding for 2 years now from PCAR. We've received their Vision of Hope grant. We're very excited about that. This project has two goals. First, to develop a preventive self-assessment process to address child sexual abuse and other youth risks that could be used in the 4,000 plus clubs across the country. And then second, to start to look at the effectiveness of this approach. Just to give you a tiniest bit of background about the situational prevention approach, it's been around for more than 40 years in creating safe housing around the world. It's been used for more than 20 years in terms of crime prevention. It's only recently been used in the areas of violence and sexual violence. It focuses on identifying risks and coming up with solutions to create a safer environment. The approach we use has 6 steps. We do brainstorming with the clubs, with youth, with parents. We do a survey to get more information on risks. For each risk, we develop either a preventive solution, which is preferred, or a risk reduction solution. The organization prioritizes those. We help them create an implementation plan for each of those risks and solutions. And then we encourage them to make a commitment to repeat the process on an annual basis to address the dynamic nature of their environment. And this seems to fit particularly well with youth-serving organizations. Very quickly, just to give you some idea of some of the areas that we look at with the brainstorm, I want to mention to you that the white area is the area that the club has a little bit more control over. The blue area is the community environment, the things that happen in the environment around that. So some of the areas that we brainstorm include characteristics of at-risk youth and their families. Might be the youth who comes in and always climbs up on someone's lap because they're needy. Might be somebody who's developmentally disabled. Might be a family that's a single-parent family that is maybe a wonderful parent but just doesn't have the time to be available because they're working really hard. We ask them to look at risks, particular locations that are risky in the club, around the club, and at places where they take their youth on field trips. We ask them to look at facilitators, which aren't risks in and of themselves, but they're things that cause a bloom of risks. So for example, on a very nice June day, a warm June day, if 2 or 3 of the staff decide that they want to go to the beach instead of work, that suddenly the staff-to-youth ratio is suffered, and there's a whole host of risks that can occur as a result of that. David had talked about the importance of looking at broader-based embedded types of programs. The way we do it is we say that if clubs are going to do this, they're going to do it one time. So we asked them to not only brainstorm risks that we believe may be connected to child sexual abuse or inappropriate sexual behavior, but also risks that have to do with safety, such as maybe mold in the walls, accident prevention, maybe broken sidewalks or old gym equipment, and issues around physical concerns, maybe gang issues that may be coming in, or bullying or something of that sort. We also ask them to brainstorm around club policies. They may be missing policies, policies that need to be adjusted, or policies that aren't communicated to staff or volunteers. When we move out into the community, we ask them to think about the policies that they bump into that don't belong to them, but affect them. So if they take their youth to the local swimming pool, and if they happen to be slotted in at a time where it's general swim, the staff not only have to worry about the safety of their kids, they have to worry about the adults who are swimming in the pool or the teenagers who are swimming that they don't know. We ask them to look at lifestyle issues, both of the families that they work with and also of their staff. The lifestyle issues of the family might be a parent who has a job where they have to be at work an hour before summer programming starts and they drop their child off, or they can't make it back in time and their child's wandering around. On the staff side, it might be a staff member who, in the dead of winter, sees a child walking home, and even though it's against the rules, makes a decision about picking them up to take them home. And we're interested in the larger community environment. Some of the clubs that we worked with in Philadelphia, they told us that in excess of 40% of the buildings around their club were abandoned. And so that's, the kids go back and forth through those abandoned buildings, they play in those. So we asked them to talk to us about that. Those are the areas that we brainstorm. I will tell you that the larger model, situational prevention model, would also pay attention to who are the offenders in the community, how many are there, how well are they treated, how well are they supervised, and of course all of it is affected by socioeconomic factors. Our boys' clubs in our nicer areas of town, I tease about them having multiple options of which desk drawer to go to get cash out of when they need something. In contrast, there are other clubs that don't have two nickels to rub together. So socioeconomic factors, they affect both the risks and all of the solutions. In year one, our focus was on tailoring the approach to the Boys and Girls Club culture and their practices, so this made sense, it resonated for them, and it fit for them. We worked through the process with, in 3 cities, 7 clubs, in inner city Philadelphia, inner city Pittsburgh, and Portland. You may ask why so much Pennsylvania. Some of it has to do with our good fortune in being funded by PCAR. And we developed an implementation manual that will help clubs on their own work through this process. And we're just starting year 2. And in year 2, the focus is on testing the effectiveness of this approach and also the satisfaction. And in a minute, I'm going to ask you if in your world the lights are blinking too. I want to make sure I'm not about to have a stroke. I guess that's a yes. And then in year 2, we're about to work with 16 clubs across 4 states, in Florida, Indiana, New Jersey, and Oregon. They're going to implement this process on their own, and they're going to give us feedback about effectiveness and satisfaction. In the future, we hope to broaden this to other organizations. I've actually used it in consultation with 2 different children's hospitals around the country, and we want to explore ways to be more effective. The last thing I want to mention in terms of strategy is, as I said to you, that thinking strategically about prevention offers opportunities for us to include everyone. The more we include everyone, the more effective we are. This is in the, there's more specific information in the handout that's already online about suggestions for intervention for different groups, different professions. But some things that we want to think about is making sure that we get more information out to parents, learning about modus operandi of offenders, and also proactive kinds of things around skills like communication, problem solving, and encouraging those things. For professionals, we want to encourage professionals to actively screen for abuse, to educate parents, also to educate other professionals, and perhaps if you're a professional who knows a lot about this, be a consultant or a resource to a prevention program so they can enhance the quality of what they're doing. For children and teens, we want them to develop strong basic skills, to learn where to get help. Also, we want them to learn healthy interpersonal relationships, and when they get older, healthy sexuality. Community members, we want to focus on bystander interventions and actually getting people to feel empowered in intervening. Einstein said, intellectuals solve problems and geniuses prevent them. Be a genius. Find the role that's comfortable for you. Find the strategies that fit for you. And as soon as that storm clears, start engaging in prevention. I want to thank the folks who supported this and contributed. Also, I do want to tell you that shamelessly, I have a book for sale that actually PCAR is selling in a very generous way, where all the proceeds go to the National Coalition to Prevent Child Sexual Abuse and Exploitation. And I want to thank you. So the first question is, did I really have hair in that video? And I just want to mention that that's a delusion that I maintain, so please don't comment on that when I see you later. Was that it?
Thanks a lot, Keith. Thank you. Okay. It's quite fitting, actually. Back home in England, dimming lights means last orders at the bar. So it's quite good at the end of the conference. We started about 10 minutes late, so I'm hoping that people don't mind if we take 10 minutes at the end just to cover some of the questions we've had from the audience. To start off with, you mentioned earlier on in your talk, Keith, that the majority of juvenile offenders will never commit another sexual crime. Why do you think this is? Is it due to rehabilitation, punishment, remorse, guilt?
Well, I think a large part of it is that if we look at the development of sexuality, that we know that adolescence is a time of amazingly broad experimentation. And I think that the combination of that experimentation along with an underdeveloped brain at times results in behaviors that are inappropriate, that are illegal. But I think for many youth, that they're not the kinds of behaviors that would persist, especially as brain development catches up and hopefully the good judgment kicks in. So I think a lot of it has to do with circumstances.
Keith, I have a question that was handed to us from a member of the audience. How do we differentiate between genuinely nice behaviors, such as being sensitive to kids, helpful to families, and grooming behaviors? In other words, how do we not become cynical/paranoid versus naive/gullible? And how do we deal with that?
It's a great question. I think that the fair answer is that you don't. And I don't think you should have the expectation that you can. And I think that you should always have the expectation that someone has the best of intentions. That said, I always think that there are ways in which we can become more involved in sports activities, in the organizations where our children spend time, with other family members. We can always ask questions. We can always promote good communication with our kids, with other kids. So I think that there are many types of strategies we can use to be vigilant, to pick out instances where someone's positive behaviors really don't reflect their intent. I will tell you that if my wife were here, she would tell you that I was in misery to be at the Walmart with or the grocery store because I was always watching other people's behavior. But that said, I think that being a little bit more vigilant wouldn't hurt anyone. And I do think it's a good message, but I think we need to empower parents. I think we need to both give them permission, and I think we need to give them very specific strategies for how to be appropriate about checking on organizations, checking on other people, how not to kill relationships, but at the same time, be active in checking out who our children are spending time with, what they're doing, and what those environments are like.
So is someone like Jason motivated by a biological urge for sexual contact, or by power, status, or by love relationship building? His strategies were to have sexual contact, but what underlies that goal-directed behavior?
How much time do you have? I think it's a really interesting question. And, for a videotape, quite honestly, these were volunteers while we were doing a national study. We were collecting data in 7 different states. This was somebody who was 18, could give their own consent, who was willing to make an educational tape. So not knowing much more than what you saw, and maybe a few more minutes, I'm not sure that I could really say what it was that motivated Jason. I mean, I do believe that for many of these youth, that they grow up in environments where their idea of what they're exposed to with regard to healthy sexuality is probably not what we would start with. So I think that, there's that component. Again, there's the underdeveloped brain. There's, maybe other types of issues at home. There are some adolescents who will grow up to have a primary arousal, to prepubescent children. So, that could be a factor to consider. But again, it's a little bit hard in retrospect, to answer that kind of question. But there's a whole host of things that we consider in doing an assessment. And of course, the purpose would be to try to put Jason in a position where he's safe to go back into the community and where the community's safe to receive him.
Keith, can the negative impacts of residency, notification, and registration laws serve as a deterrent for those who might be inclined to offend?
Well, I guess what I'd say to answer that is that, the research findings, once we have findings that identify that, we don't seem to see effectiveness of this to reduce recidivism, once we see findings that seem to suggest that it motivates the community to raise up in arms around them, that it gets in the way of their reintegration, those kinds of things. I think, is it possible that for some offenders it is a deterrent? Sure. But I think that, when we start to look scientifically and collect this information, I think that there are larger concerns about strategies. And again, I hope I was careful enough to say that we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There may be places in which, and offenders that we want to make sure we keep doing registration with. I'm just not sure that it makes sense for the whole scope of offenders.
Keith, I have, again, a question from a member of the audience here. To what extent may child sex offenders be identified as ephebophiles, if I'm pronouncing that right, i.e. having primary sexual attraction to post-pubescent teens prior to adulthood? Right.
And that's the more technical term for somebody who has primary arousal to a minor adolescent. I think that again, it's a group that would have to meet those same criteria, the DSM-3 or DSM-4 or 5 criteria. I don't know that I would, in general, describe them as that different in terms of behavior, other than them having that primary focus on minor adolescents rather than young children. Same potential for negative outcomes. And again, we didn't have a lot of time to talk about this, but there are some real interesting programs in Germany. One called Dunkenfeld, which I guess means dark field, that David and I were both at a conference and we heard about. They've been around for about 8 to 10 years and have been reaching out to individuals who would have this type of arousal to either a child or an adolescent, and they showed some pretty positive types of findings in terms of getting those folks to call in even before they offended, and in some cases folks who offended but weren't identified. So I think that that's an area where we should be focusing more and looking at some of the programs they have there and whether or not they fit for us in terms of being proactive.
Some groups previously took a treatment reintegration approach, but later adopted a one strike and you're out approach after sex abuse scandals. What lessons may we learn from these approaches moving forward?
Well, if I understand the question, if you're talking about what our thoughts are about when we incarcerate people who are identified as offending, I hope that part of the message you get from the data that I showed is that there's probably a much larger group of offenders in general and adolescent offenders in particular that could probably be treated in the community or in a residential facility, that we're probably sending too many people to prison. We're probably spending way too much money, and that a lot of these folks would be safer. If you take a look at the behavior in Minnesota, Minnesota is a state that has almost never incarcerated adolescent offenders. They've always been in residentially based types of treatment programs, and you just don't open the newspaper and find that in Minnesota, that the cities are overrun with sex offenders. So, I think it raises the issue that we need to be a little bit more thoughtful about where we place offenders and what our belief is about how that serves the long-term process of a safer community and getting people to be productive in that community.
So I think that ends our Q&A session and I guess today's activities, if I can get up here. Tom Poole is here to talk about the weather, so please don't go anywhere. Thank you, Keith Kaufman, for being here.